You know what I like? Consoles. You know what else I like? Thinking. So that got me thinking about the most influential consoles in gaming history. We're just getting started in the 8th generation gaming, so why not go back in history and list out what we, or I, since I don't care what Dan or Jake think, are the top 10 most influential consoles in history. Keep in mind these aren't necessarily my most favorite consoles, but rather those that I feel have the biggest impact on the industry. Also, I'm listing these in chronological order and not by which console is best, so don't hurt me for its placement. Hurt Jake instead. And the penis. Hard. The Atari 2600. You gotta give it up to the granddaddy of all consoles. It's pretty much the Model T of video games, and laid the foundation for all consoles to come. It wasn't the first video game console, but it was by far the best of its time. Sure, most games are crap, and the glut of such games pretty much killed the game industry in America, aside from PC games. But you have to admit, being able to play games in our home instead of going out to some arcade that was probably had some pedophiles trying to get kids, that was such a big revolution. And plus, we got to stay home without having to go outside where that sun is. Good times. The Nintendo Entertainment System. The original NES. The necessary parachute after we were launched off the catapult that was the Atari 2600. It was Nintendo's smart, swift moves that resurrected gaming in America. More importantly, Nintendo learned from Atari's mistakes, locking out its console unless developers were given the okay to develop for it, a practice that exists to this day. Nintendo has never been as big as it was back in the NES days. Mario was king. So much so that we all saw that awful The Wizard movie just to get a glimpse of Super Mario Bros. 3. You thought games today had a lot of hype. I don't see any gamers watching a feature-length film just to catch a glimpse of the new Halo. The Game Boy! While Nintendo didn't bring consoles into our living room, they definitely brought games on the go. Well, I could give this to their Game & Watch handheld, since that was the Game Boy's predecessor. Nothing can beat the quality and longevity of the original Game Boy. Released in '89, it gave us classic Nintendo games on the go, and would continue to do so until its successor was released in 2001. Gamers today are lucky that you don't need to purchase a pack of AA batteries every month just to play Tetris everywhere. The Sega Genesis. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Even after all these years, that phrase still hasn't been forgotten. And, in a strange way, Sega is still doing what Nintendo isn't. But that's because they're ruining their franchises and dying. But we're talking about the Sega Genesis here. Nintendo gave us the birth and adolescence of gaming, but Sega brought us into our teenage years. Mortal Kombat on the Genesis proved that games weren't just for kids anymore, and Sega earned their coolness badge, shut up, that was totally a thing, with console gamers everywhere. Another notch in Sega's belt was their successful lawsuit against Nintendo for monopolistic practices. For years, Nintendo forced third parties to develop for their consoles only, essentially making companies exclusive to them. But the court slapped them down and gave developers the freedom to make games for any and all consoles. The best thing about the Sega Genesis is one that very few people actually know about, the Sega Channel. 2 years before streaming video games was even thought about in our minds, Sega was doing that very thing with the Sega Channel, a subscription-based service through your cable provider that allowed you to play games through a cable with a special game card. Yes, you heard that right, guys. In the mid-90s, Sega actually let you stream games. Unfortunately, only a few people actually experienced it, and I was one of them. And it was awesome. Say what you will about Sega, the company was very forward-thinking when it came to games. We can only imagine where that 90s Sega spirit would lead the gaming industry today. The Super Nintendo. If the Super Nintendo has one fault, it's the fact that it's merely a more beefy version of the original NES. However, that's its only fault, and even then not a very big one, if you consider it a fault at all. When we reminisce about the classic games of our younger years, most games we remember from the Super Nintendo. It's where a lot of the classics were either born or refined. Super Mario World further refined Mario 3's controls, giving us gameplay so smooth you can spread it on toast. Role-playing games finally wooed us with fantastic titles like Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, and Secret of Mana with their incredible stories and characters. Street Fighter popularized the fighting game genre and gave us combos and Hadoukens and stuff that we continue to do to this day. It was a great time to be a gamer in the 90s. The PlayStation. If the Genesis could be considered responsible for bringing us into our teenage years, then Sony's PlayStation definitely gave us that next step in the evolution. Things got downright adult-y with the PS1, not in a porno way, of course. This system didn't turn Jake into a chronic masturbator. Rather, this gave us R-rated content, from horror games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill to more in-depth gameplay with 3D graphics. We rocked out to Dance Dance Revolution and Parappa the Rapper, and even mature storylines from Final Fantasy Tactics and Suikoden 2. The PlayStation gave us the best of what the Genesis and Super Nintendo had to offer and cranked it up to 11, and the sales proved it. It was the first console to break the 100 million sales mark, and it deserved each and every one of those. The Nintendo 64. The N64 was dwarfed by Sony's PlayStation, but it deserves a spot on this list for one simple thing. Sure, I could list just about every popular 64 game, which is still considered classics to this day. Sure, it had the most powerful hardware of its day, but all that really doesn't matter as much as the beloved analog stick. That joystick gives you 360 degrees of movement, something Sony evidently forgot when they were creating their 3D console. Sometimes it's the smallest details that make the biggest impact. The Sega Dreamcast. The one console you regret ever breaking up with. Love playing games online on your console? Well, you have the Sega Dreamcast to thank for that. Way back in 1999, the Dreamcast let you do exactly that. Sega, ever the forward-thinking company, had their console online ready out of the box. A feat not even the Xbox, which released 2 years later, could do at launch. The PlayStation 2. What can I say about the PS2 that hasn't already been explained and experienced by everyone on the planet? It's the most popular console ever. It gave us memorable titles like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Final Fantasy X, Devil May Cry 3, God of War, the Ratchet & Clank trilogy, Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3, Resident Evil 4, Kingdom Hearts, Gran Turismo 3, Silent Hill 2, Jak and Daxter, Prince of Persia, Star Wars Battlefront, Guitar Hero. The list is so long that I could make an entire movie just trying to fit everything onto one video. Even if it already wasn't the most sold system in history, it deserves a spot on this list just for the amount of quality titles released in its lifetime. The Nintendo Wii. If you hate motion-based gaming, then you have this funky little system to thank for that. Sure, we had the iToy and the PS2, but that was just an interesting diversion. The Wii proved that you could sell the system merely by getting customers to use their imagination. Admit it, we all bought a Wii because we imagined ourselves being a badass Samuel L. Jackson with a lightsaber. Unfortunately, the Wii could never really deliver on that promise. To make things worse, Sony and Microsoft jumped on the motion-controlled bandwagon long after it had broken down on the side of the road. Thankfully, Sony dropped their Move controller soon after the launch, but Microsoft continued to support their Kinect camera years after people realized that it was absolutely awful for anything aside from Dance Central. Of course, they forcefully bundled it with the Xbox One. If that person isn't begging for cigarettes on street corners, then there's no justice in the world. That's my top 10. I'm sure most of you would disagree with at least one entry up here. So let me know what your top 10 most influential consoles are in the comments. Who knows, if you change my mind, I might even send you a cookie.